You've read Genesis 3 verse 17 100 times and missed the setup. Everyone assumes God is spitting out a punishment here. That's the natural reading, and it feels obvious on the surface, especially the first time you read it. But the actual Hebrew word behind cursed tells a different story. It's not primarily about payback. It's about something being bound and held back. That single distinction changes how this whole passage should land on you. Stick around because by the end you'll never read this verse the same way again. Let's set the scene first. Genesis is the book of beginnings. It opens the entire Bible story. Chapter 3 is the hinge point of the whole narrative. This is the moment sin enters a perfect world. Before this chapter, everything was good, and God said so himself. After this chapter, everything gets complicated. Tradition credits Moses as the writer of Genesis. He wrote it for the people of Israel, centuries after Eden. He wrote it to explain where their broken world actually came from. These were people wandering through a harsh desert, farming stubborn soil, burying loved ones far too young. They needed to know why the world felt so hard to live in. Genesis 3 gave them that answer, and it still gives us that answer today. Every struggle you feel today, every hard season, traces its roots back to this one chapter. Now let's walk through the passage itself. God has just confronted Adam and the woman in the garden. He already spoke to the serpent first, and that order matters. Genesis 3:14 records God saying the serpent is cursed above all cattle. That word gets used clearly and directly there. Then God turns to the woman in verse 16. He describes pain in childbirth and tension in her marriage. Notice something here though. God never uses the word cursed for her either. Now God turns to Adam. Read the actual line closely. He says, "Cursed is the ground because of you." Not "Cursed are you, Adam." The ground takes the direct hit here, not the man standing in front of God. That small detail gets skipped in almost every sermon you've ever heard in this passage. So what does cursed even mean in this specific verse? The Hebrew word used here is Arar, and it shows up dozens of times across the entire Old Testament. Scholars who dig deep into this word notice something most simple. English translations completely fail to capture. It doesn't primarily mean hateful, vindictive, or wishing outright destruction on something. At its root, Ar carries the older sense of binding, restricting, and holding real potential back from being fully realized. Picture a rope tied tightly around something that still has plenty of life left inside it. That mental picture lands much closer to the original meaning than fire and brimstone ever could. The opposite Hebrew word is barak, and barak means blessing. Blessing in Hebrew thought means to set free and to empower growth. So if blessing is release and freedom, cursing in this sense is the reverse of that picture. It's restriction, not blind rage. It's a binding, not a tantrum. Now watch how this plays out in the rest of verse 17 through 19. God says the ground will only produce through painful, exhausting labor. Thorns and thistles will grow up where easy fruit once grew. Adam will sweat for every loaf of bread he eats. Verse 19 ends with dust returning to dust, a picture of mortality entering the human story. Every single line here describes limitation, not annihilation. The ground used to give freely and abundantly before this moment. Now it holds back what it used to offer without a fight. That's the binding actually playing out, not some angry lightning bolt thrown down from heaven. Here's another Hebrew word worth knowing here too, just for contrast. It's the word Kalal, and it shows up later in Genesis chapter 12. God tells Abraham that whoever belittles him, using that word Kalal, will be met with Ar in return. So Hebrew actually has more than one word for cursing, and they carry different weights. Kalal means to treat something as small or worthless. Arar means to bind and restrict its power. Knowing that difference helps you see Genesis 3:17 with fresh eyes. God isn't calling the ground worthless or small in that verse. He's saying its power to produce freely just got bound up tight. Fast forward a few chapters and you'll find one more clue hiding in plain sight. Genesis 5:9 introduces a baby named Noah, born many long generations after that first garden. His own father names him carefully, with a specific and very deliberate hope attached to that name. He says this child will bring comfort concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord has cursed. Notice that word choice again, the exact same idea from chapter 3. Generations later, people were still feeling that binding on the ground, still waiting for relief from it. That's not a small detail. That's an entire family line holding on to hope that the restriction would someday lift. Here's where this gets genuinely practical for your life today. This moment is not God torching the earth out of spite or losing his temper. This is a natural consequence of a broken relationship between people and the creation around them. Sin entered the picture, and the ground's generous nature got bound up right along with it. Paul picks up this exact idea centuries later in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 8, he says, "Creation itself was subjected to frustration." But notice what he adds immediately after that phrase, the words, "in hope." The binding was never meant to be the final, permanent state of things. Think about your own work situation right now for a second. Maybe your job feels like pulling stubborn thorns out of hard, dry ground every single day. Maybe nothing comes easy for you, no matter how hard you push against it. That frustration you feel building up is not just random bad luck falling on you. It's the exact same pattern first described back in Genesis chapter 3. It's restriction happening where there used to be complete freedom. But here's the genuinely encouraging part of this whole picture. Paul says that restriction comes bundled together with hope attached to it. According to Scripture, it is not meant to be the final word on the matter. Picture a gardener who plants seeds every single spring with real care, patience, and honest effort. Some years the soil cooperates without much of a fight, and some years it pushes back hard against every hour of work. A parent raising young kids through sleepless nights feels this same restriction in a completely different shape entirely. Love flows freely and constantly, yet the whole process still involves real struggle, real exhaustion, and real tears along the way. A student staying up late studying for exams feels it too, pouring long hours in and still hitting walls that never seem to move. None of that struggle means God is punishing any of these people directly. It means every one of them is living inside a world still bound by that ancient restriction. Once you see the pattern, you start noticing it absolutely everywhere around you. Let's clear up two questions people constantly ask about this specific passage. First question, does this mean God actually hates the physical world he made? The answer is simply no, and the text supports that clearly. God is not lashing out at dirt because he's suddenly angry at nature itself. The ground gets described here as suffering right alongside humanity, almost like a companion caught in the fallout of someone else's choice. Second question, are humans personally, directly cursed by this specific verse? Look at the actual text one more time. Adam gets told plainly that he will struggle, sweat, and eventually die. But the word cursed never actually gets applied to Adam himself in verse 17. Only the ground receives that exact label in this passage. Compare that to Genesis chapter 4, where Cain is told directly, "You are cursed from the ground." Cain does get that word applied to him personally later on. Adam, back in chapter 3, does not get that same direct label. That's a meaningful distinction worth noticing, and it should change how heavy this verse feels sitting on your shoulders. Here's a third question worth clearing up while we're at it. Is this restriction on the ground permanent, with no end in sight ever? Scripture actually answers that one directly, more than once. Revelation chapter 22 promises a future where there shall be no more curse at all. The binding that started in Genesis 3 gets fully undone by the very last page of the Bible. That's the entire story arc in miniature, from one bound garden to one fully restored one. The end of the story answers the confusion planted at the very beginning of it. Let's bring this all together now into one clear picture. Cursed in Genesis 30:17 does not mean God unleashed pure hatred onto the earth that day. It means something naturally good got bound up and held back from its full potential. The ground's generous, abundant nature was restricted because human sin entered the world through one choice. That's the exact misconception this video set out to clear up for you from the very start. You opened this video wondering if that word simply meant punishment in the harsh way we usually picture it. Now you know it actually points toward restraint rather than rage, and restraint always carries within it the real possibility of eventual release. That's exactly what Paul meant by hope in Romans 8, and it's exactly what gets promised again later in Revelation, where the curse itself finally gets removed for good. Before you watch the next video in this series, go read Genesis chapter 3 for yourself, start to finish. Sit with verse 17 slowly this time, instead of rushing past it like you probably have before. Then drop a comment down below and tell me where in your own life something feels bound up and restricted right now. I genuinely want to read what you write. And if this kind of plain, no-fluff Bible study actually helps you understand Scripture better, go ahead and subscribe right now. Because next week we're unpacking another verse that everyone assumes they already understand. But almost nobody actually does. So the next time someone tells you this verse is simply about God's raw anger, you'll know better than that now. It's fundamentally about a rope tied tight, not a punishment thrown in rage. And ropes, unlike rage, can always eventually be untied. Hold on to that picture the next time your own life feels stuck or restricted for no clear reason. You're not being punished out of spite. You're living inside a story that is already moving toward its own release. That's the kind of hope worth carrying with you long after this video ends.